In 1871, a photographer vanished after developing a series of portraits in a small American town. The last plate he exposed captured not life, but something far more unearthly. The faces of the grieving family behind the corpse had changed. The screen lingers, whispering static. An old shutter click echoes. For 8 seconds, the viewer confronts not a mystery, but a wound. The image does not just suggest death. It breathes it. This is not merely about memento mori, the Victorian tradition of photographing the dead. This is about what was summoned when Americans, still haunted by war and epidemic, began capturing the silence of corpses. A practice that should have been innocent remembrance, instead became something else, ritual. And in one forgotten Massachusetts village, those rituals were perfected into something far darker. Something that consumed families, their lineage, and eventually, the memory of the town itself. What you are about to see is not history. It is a dirge buried beneath history. The mid-19th century was soaked in grief. The Civil War had cleaved through hundreds of thousands of families. Cholera, tuberculosis, and influenza swept through cities like fire. Death was no stranger, it was a house guest. In those years, death photography became the great democratizer. For a few dollars, the bereaved could immortalize their loved ones, posed as if still alive. Children stood with dolls, eyes painted open in the final prints. Mothers reclined in chairs, stiff necks bound beneath lace. Infants were placed in baskets, tiny wax flowers tucked into their hands. These photographs comforted the living. They were not seen as grotesque, but as holy, a testament that love survived beyond the grave. Yet, in some places, that holiness was inverted. A kind of shadow practice began to spread through rumor. Stories whispered of photographers who did not merely document the dead, but used the process itself to bind them. In Salem, whispers told of men who painted pupils too wide and found their subjects whispering back. In Philadelphia, a widow swore her dead husband turned his head in the photograph. And in the town of Greyhaven, Massachusetts, a group of families began to seek out photographers not to preserve memory, but to prolong presence. Greyhaven does not appear on most maps today. Incorporated in 1823, it flourished briefly on the textile trade before fires and famine hollowed it out. The ruins are said to still exist, swallowed by forest, a scatter of stone foundations, and collapsed mills. But in its heyday, Greyhaven was a place of both industry and obsession. The local church, St. Icarus of the Vale, presided over more than worship. It presided over mourning. Records indicate that the town suffered disproportionately high mortality rates, fevers, accidents, drownings in the mill canals. Local folklore claimed the soil itself was cursed, poisoned by an older sin. Families responded not with flight, but with devotion. They built shrines, conducted lengthy mourning rituals, and became fixated on memento mori photography. One photographer in particular, Edwin Harrow, became infamous for his portraits of the dead. His images were whispered about as too vivid, too real. Some said he could capture not only the appearance but the essence of the deceased. What happened in Greyhaven was not isolated grief. It was the systematic weaving of mourning into ritual until the veil between the living and the dead frayed beyond repair. Harrow's studio stood at the corner of Bridge and Lantern Street. The last surviving daguerreotypes show a tall building with narrow windows, always shuttered. Inside, he worked by candlelight. The walls, witnesses claimed, were hung not with portraits of the living but entirely of the dead. His process was unusual. Where most photographers worked swiftly, Harrow demanded silence. He insisted families remain in the room while the photograph developed, often in absolute darkness. Witnesses later testified that he murmured words while preparing the plates. A chant? A prayer? No one could be certain. The images he produced had a strange clarity. Eyes glimmered with unnatural brightness. Shadows fell in strange directions. In some, faint figures appeared behind the subjects, as though the photograph had captured more than the room contained. Families returned to him, again and again, not merely for keepsakes, but because, according to rumor, those who hung his portraits in their homes heard voices at night. The dead did not fade. They lingered. And Harrow, it is said, charged not in dollars, but in promises. The most chilling records from Greyhaven concern the children. In household after household, children died young. Scarlet fever, cholera, accidents in the millworks. The town's cemetery swelled with small graves, each marked with angelic statues staring into eternity. But parents did not merely bury their children. They brought them to Harrow. His child portraits are the most disturbing. Tiny bodies propped in rocking chairs, ribbons tied beneath waxy chins, small hands clutching flowers. In several, the children's eyes gleam with a strange wetness, as though the lids were not quite sealed. Rumors grew that some parents heard their children's voices after the portraits were taken, whispers from empty cradles, footsteps in abandoned rooms. The church did not intervene. In fact, sermons at St. Icarus began echoing Harrow's language. The veil between life and death is not a wall, but a window. Families became dependent. Children were photographed again and again, even posthumously, until their likenesses filled parlors like shrines. But the children, it seems, did not rest. And the parents? They did not let go. By 1873, Harrow was no longer just a photographer. He was a figure of devotion. The surviving diary of Lydia Crane, a millworker's widow, describes what she called the covenant. She writes of meetings held at night in Harrow's studio. The doors bolted, curtains drawn, families entering with offerings, not just coins, but heirlooms, even locks of hair. What took place inside remains uncertain, but fragments suggest ritualized mourning transformed into something darker. Harrow promised, in Lydia's words, that no family in Greyhaven would ever truly lose its blood. The portraits became contracts. The more you commissioned, the stronger the bond. But there was a cost. Lydia writes of shadows growing in her home, of her husband's portrait, taken months after his death, beginning to change. His eyes no longer kind, his mouth no longer still. And then, on the night of her infant's funeral, she swore the photograph turned its head. The covenant spread across the town. Families bound themselves not only to memory, but to Harrow himself. It was no longer mourning. It was worship. After the covenant took root, Greyhaven began to unravel. Children vanished from their beds. Women were reported missing, last seen walking the dark lanes near the church. The town constable filed reports, but these abruptly ceased in 1875. What remained were rumors that families, desperate to deepen the bond, offered sacrifices, not only of hair or belongings, but of life itself. The cemetery shows a sharp drop in burials after this period. Death did not stop, yet the graves no longer filled. Where did the bodies go? Travelers through Greyhaven in the 1870s spoke of silence. Curtains always drawn. No laughter in the streets. The sound of weeping at night, from houses where no one lived. And in Harrow's studio, glass plates piled higher and higher, each containing not a photograph, but, according to whispers, a prison. Those who left Greyhaven rarely spoke of it again. But one drifter recalled looking through Harrow's shop window at dusk. Inside, the portraits seemed to shimmer, faces twitching, eyes following him. He swore some of them moved. At the edge of Greyhaven stood St. Icarus Orphan Home, run by the church. Records indicate a steady intake of children during the 1860s and 70s. Children left parentless by fever, by mill accidents, by poverty. But in 1876, the records stop. The building itself burned the following year. Local lore insists Harrow was often seen at the orphanage. Some say he offered his services for free, photographing the dead or dying children. Others whispered the children were used in experiments, forced to sit before his camera while still alive, eyes wide, as he muttered incantations beneath his breath. A farmer's wife testified decades later that she saw lines of orphans walking toward the church late at night, clutching one another's hands, silent as stone. She claimed they never returned. No graves were ever found for the last 27 children enrolled at St. Icarus. But 3 surviving plates, discovered in an attic years later, show children seated in rows, rigid, their eyes too dark, too deep. Behind them looms a figure, tall, shadowed, his face blurred as though the camera itself refused to reveal him. Some believe this was Harrow. Others say it was not human. By 1880, Greyhaven was no longer a town. Businesses shuttered. Families fled. Mills collapsed into ruin. And Harrow? He disappeared. No death record, no grave, no trace. Only the plates remained, hundreds of them, scattered across attics, basements, and barns. A Boston journalist, Elias Morton, visited Greyhaven in 1882 to write about its collapse. His notes, later discovered in a trunk, describe a place empty of the living, yet swollen with presence. He claimed the houses smelled of ash and mildew, yet were filled with photographs nailed to the walls, covering every surface. He found them in bedrooms, kitchens, even stables. He wrote, "It was as if the living had abandoned the town to the dead." Morton's notes end abruptly. His last entry reads only, "The faces watch me. They know I am not of them." He was never seen again. Greyhaven slipped into legend, the name erased from most records, its remains reclaimed by forest. But the plates survive, dispersed into collections, antique shops, even museums. And wherever they went, stories followed. The 20th century brought photography into the modern age. Daguerreotypes gave way to film, and film to celluloid. Harrow's plates should have faded into obscurity. Yet they reappeared, auctioned in New York, collected by antiquarians, even displayed briefly at the Boston Historical Society in 1911. Visitors complained of unease. Some swore the images shifted when unobserved. Guards refused to work at night, claiming they heard whispers in the gallery. One photograph in particular, the Crane family portrait, showing Lydia and her deceased child, became infamous. Reports claimed the child's eyes would slowly open under moonlight, even when sealed in glass. The exhibit was closed within weeks. The plates were returned to storage, but several were stolen. Those who possessed them rarely kept them long. Families claimed sleeplessness, voices, shadows moving in the glass. By the 1930s, Harrow's name was spoken only among occultists and folklorists. They believed his work was not photography, but necromancy, an unholy fusion of light, silver, and invocation. And so, the plates remain, circulating quietly, waiting. St. Icarus of the Vale was more than Greyhaven's parish. It was the axis around which the town rotated. Births, marriages, burials, all passed through its black doors. Yet when the covenant spread, the church did not condemn it. Quite the opposite. Sermons grew darker, echoing Harrow's philosophy. Priests spoke of death not as departure, but as transition. The surviving parish ledger reveals chilling details, lists of names besides strange notations, bound, sealed, retained. None correspond to sacraments. Why would a church sanction this? Perhaps desperation. Epidemics gutted congregations. War stole sons and fathers. To promise continuity, even through a photograph, was power. But some whispered the priests were not simply complicit, they were guiding it. Harrow, it seems, was no lone heretic. He was their instrument. And in the basement of St. Icarus, locked behind iron doors, families gathered to stare at their portraits in candlelight, chanting hymns rewritten with darker words. It was not faith in Christ they worshipped. It was faith in the image. In 1924, during renovations of a church in Salem, workers uncovered a sealed chest. Inside was a water-stained ledger, now known among folklorists as the Greyhaven Register. Its pages cataloged names, dates, and numbers. At first glance, a death record. But closer inspection revealed otherwise. The same names repeated multiple times, sometimes years after their documented death. Beside them, inscriptions, eyes open. Voice returned. Subject restless. The register linked Greyhaven's tragedy to a larger network. At least 6 other towns appeared in its margins, small villages across New England, each with unusually high mortality and sudden abandonment. Who kept the register? Some argue Harrow himself. Others, the priests of St. Icarus. One page was torn almost entirely out. Only a fragment remains. The child does not belong to them. It belongs to the name, ripped away. But the implication is clear. Greyhaven was not isolated. It was one chapter of something older, spreading like a hidden rot through America's quietest corners. Few fled Greyhaven. Fewer still spoke of it. In 1891, a woman named Abigail Rhodes, once a parishioner, confessed her memories to a physician in Boston. His notes, later published in a medical journal, describe a woman haunted not by madness, but by memory. She spoke of her sister's portrait whispering lullabies at night, even years after the burial. She described her mother refusing to eat unless seated across from her dead husband's photograph, which seemed to fog the glass as though breathing. Abigail claimed she once saw Harrow without his mask of politeness. She described his eyes as two black wells where no reflection could live. She insisted he was not merely human, but a vessel. The physician dismissed her as delusional. She died in an asylum within the year. Yet, decades later, her words resonate. Greyhaven was not abandoned. It was consumed by the faces on the walls and by the silence between the shutter clicks. By the turn of the century, whispers of Greyhaven troubled scholars. Local historians attempted to publish articles about the town's strange decline. Each time, the publications were withdrawn. Records vanished from state archives. Maps from the 1830s through 1880s were found altered, Greyhaven's name carefully scraped away. Even census records bore strange omissions. It was as though someone wanted the town erased, not merely forgotten, but unremembered. Who orchestrated this? Some point to the church, others to early government agencies wary of panic. Yet one theory persists, that suppression was not an act of mercy, but necessity. For to speak Greyhaven's name was to invite it back. Photographs, after all, do not fade in silence. They wait, and when remembered, they awaken. In private letters, one archivist warned a colleague, "Do not catalog Harrow's plates. They are not objects. They are doors." The letters ended abruptly. In 1935, a wealthy antiquarian named Charles Whitmore purchased several of Harrow's surviving plates at auction. He was fascinated by Victorian mourning culture, dismissing tales of curses as folklore. He displayed the portraits in his home, lit carefully by gas lamps. Guests marveled at their clarity. But within weeks, his servants began resigning. They complained of whispers from the gallery at night, of footsteps across the floorboards when the house was empty. Whitmore's own letters betray his dissent. He described one portrait, of a young boy, that seemed to change expression over time. At first sorrowful, then resentful, finally hungry. He wrote, "I awoke last night to find the glass fogged from within, as though the child were breathing against it. When I wiped it clean, the eyes were no longer still." In February of 1936, Whitmore vanished. His mansion stood silent, his wealth untouched. Only the plates remained, stacked neatly in the gallery, each one smeared faintly with condensation. Neighbors swore they heard children's laughter echoing from the empty halls. In 1942, amid wartime chaos, the Museum of American Antiquities in Boston received a crate labeled simply Greyhaven. Inside were 15 of Harrow's plates, wrapped in decayed linen. The museum's archivist, Samuel Kern, began cataloging them. His notes survive, trembling script that begins clinical but soon collapses into terror. At first, he observed unusual vibrancy in the eyes of the subjects. Then, unease in prolonged viewing. Days later, subjects appear subtly altered, slight movements between examinations. His final entries dissolve into near illegible scrawl. They are aware. The plates respond when unwrapped at night. One called my name. The crate was resealed and placed in restricted storage. Samuel Kern was later found dead in his office. No sign of struggle. Only a camera beside him, its last exposure fogged with static and shadow. The plates have not been seen publicly since. Among Harrow's rumored works, one has achieved near-mythic status, the final photograph. Accounts describe it as unlike his others, larger, heavier, framed in black oak. Instead of a single subject, it supposedly shows the entire congregation of St. Icarus gathered in the church basement. But the faces are wrong. Distorted, smiling too wide, eyes reflecting no light. Some claim the image does not remain static, that those who look long enough see the congregation shift, until the pews empty and the viewer finds themselves standing inside the photograph, surrounded by the Greyhaven dead. The plate's location remains unknown. Some insist it was hidden by the church. Others whisper it still circulates in private collections, emerging at night to claim new witnesses. No one admits to having seen it directly. Yet every folklorist who writes of Greyhaven refers to the same description, word for word, as though the story itself were transmitted like an infection. Though Greyhaven was erased, its family scattered. Traces of their bloodlines remain in towns across New England. Genealogical studies reveal something peculiar. Descendants often report vivid dreams of shadowed rooms filled with portraits. Some claim to awaken to the sound of shutters clicking in the dark. Psychologists dismiss this as inherited trauma, folklore carried through generations. But patterns persist. Children speaking in voices not their own, photographs and family albums showing faces that no one remembers. One chilling case from 1949 involved a Rhode Island family descended from the Cranes. Their young daughter began insisting that grandfather was watching her from the picture frame. The only problem, the photograph she pointed to showed no one at all, just a blank square of aged paper. It seems Greyhaven's legacy did not perish with the town. It lives on, threaded through bloodlines, awakening in the presence of images. In the late 1940s, a strange trend emerged in American newspapers, scattered reports of haunted photographs. Families writing to editors about portraits that moved, smiled, or whispered. Though dismissed as hysteria, the descriptions bear uncanny resemblance to Harrow's plates. Some suspect these were fragments of his lost collection resurfacing in private homes. Others argue that the Greyhaven curse had detached from its artifacts, spreading through the very act of photography itself. For what is a photograph, if not an invitation? Light and shadow bound in silver, freezing time, and perhaps binding more than memory. Modern cameras democratized the ritual Harrow perfected. Millions of shutters clicking, millions of faces sealed in glass and film. If Greyhaven was once a single wound, photography itself may have become the infection. And if the covenant was never broken, then every photograph carries the possibility of opening the door again. The story of Greyhaven is not officially written in history books. It lingers in margins, rumors, forbidden ledgers, stolen plates. But the silence surrounding it may be more terrifying than the story itself. For silence is where Greyhaven thrives. In the pause between heartbeats. In the second between shutter clicks. In the breath held when staring too long at an image that does not blink. Perhaps Edwin Harrow was not a man, but a medium. Perhaps the covenant was not made with the church, but with the camera itself. And perhaps, even now, you have felt it, while looking at photographs too long into the night. That moment when the eyes seem wet, when the mouth seems poised to move, when you are certain you are being watched. The dead of Greyhaven were never buried. They were framed. And the longer we look, the closer they come. Close on a black screen. A single shutter click. Then silence.